In the months following Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy believed the war in the Pacific was already tilting decisively in its favor. Their carrier fleets had struck with speed and precision. American battleships lay sunk or damaged, and U.S. forces appeared to be reeling across the ocean. Inside Japanese naval headquarters, this success produced more than confidence. It produced certainty. Japanese intelligence officers concluded that the United States simply lacked the kind of pilots needed to fight a modern carrier war. Reports circulating among senior commanders described American aviators as rushed through training programs and dependent on technology rather than skill. These pilots, they believed, lacked patience, discipline, and the instinctive judgment required in aerial combat. Compared to Japan's naval airmen, who trained for years and often logged thousands of flight hours before ever seeing combat, American pilots were dismissed as amateurs. The assumption took hold that bravery alone could not compensate for inferior preparation. This belief was reinforced by Japan's own experience. Japanese carrier pilots were among the most elite in the world. Many had fought extensively in China, refining their tactics in real combat. They practiced long-range strikes, tight formations, and precise coordination between fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes. Their doctrine emphasized perfection. Every movement was rehearsed. Every attack followed a strict plan. Against such refinement, American pilots were not seen as a serious threat. What Japanese intelligence failed to recognize was the difference between training for control and training for chaos. American naval aviation doctrine emphasized flexibility over perfection. U.S. pilots were taught to make decisions independently, to continue attacking even when communications failed, and to improvise when plans collapsed. These qualities were difficult to measure and easy to dismiss, especially by analysts focused on flight hours and formal skill. Early warning signs were ignored. During the Battle of the Coral Sea, American pilots damaged Japanese carriers and sank the Shoho. Rather than reassessing their assumptions, Japanese intelligence labeled the results as luck, a temporary setback, not evidence of a deeper problem. The core belief remained untouched. When the decisive battle came, American pilots would falter. By early 1942, this assumption shaped Japan's entire strategy. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto approved a plan to lure the remaining American carriers into a decisive engagement near Midway Atoll. The operation depended on precision, timing, and above all, predictability. Japanese commanders believed they understood how Americans would respond. They expected disorganization, poorly coordinated attacks, and rapid defeat once contact was made. There was confidence. There was certainty. And there was no fear. At Midway, Japanese intelligence believed they were not facing equals, but opponents already measured and found lacking. What followed would expose how dangerous that belief truly was. Japanese confidence before Midway did not rest on arrogance alone. It was rooted in a belief system that had guided their naval aviation for decades. The Imperial Japanese Navy believed war was decided by elite skill, not mass production. Pilots were selected carefully, trained slowly, and pushed to master their aircraft to near perfection. Only the best survived the process. Those who did were treated as irreplaceable assets, the sharp edge of Japan's naval power. This system produced extraordinary aviators, but it also created a dangerous illusion. Japanese commanders believed that superior training would always defeat larger numbers. In their view, combat was a contest of refinement. Precision would overcome chaos. Experience would crush improvisation. This belief worked early in the war, when Japanese pilots overwhelmed opponents who were truly unprepared. Over China, Southeast Asia, and during the opening blows of the Pacific War, Japanese airmen dominated the skies. Each victory reinforced the idea that quality alone decided outcomes. American pilot training was evaluated through this narrow lens. U.S. naval aviation expanded rapidly after Pearl Harbor. Training pipelines were shortened. New squadrons formed quickly. To Japanese intelligence officers, this was proof of weakness. They saw speed as a substitute for skill and assumed American pilots were unseasoned, careless, and overly dependent on rigid procedures. What they did not see was the system behind the speed. American doctrine accepted imperfection. It assumed pilots would make mistakes. It trained them to recover, adapt, and continue fighting. U.S. aviators were encouraged to think independently and act aggressively even when orders were unclear or plans failed. This approach produced uneven results early in the war, but it also produced resilience. Japanese intelligence did not measure resilience. It measured hours, formations, and drills. There was another blind spot. Japanese planners believed their pilots were too valuable to lose. Training replacements took years. As a result, doctrine emphasized protecting experienced airmen and preserving strength for decisive moments. American doctrine assumed losses would happen and built systems to absorb them. This difference would prove critical, but before Midway, it went largely unnoticed. As intelligence reports moved up the chain of command, they became more confident, not more cautious. Each assessment repeated the same conclusion. American pilots lacked the training to coordinate complex attacks. They would break formation. They would attack piecemeal. They would retreat when faced with heavy resistance. These assumptions were treated as facts, not theories. By the spring of 1942, this belief was no longer questioned. It shaped how Japanese carriers prepared for battle. It shaped how fighter defenses were organized. It shaped expectations of how the enemy would behave. In war, expectations can be as dangerous as ignorance. At Midway, Japanese commanders did not plan for American success. They planned for American failure. And when planning is built on certainty rather than doubt, even small surprises can become fatal. Japanese intelligence before Midway was thorough, but it was not curious. Analysts collected reports, tracked ship movements, and measured aircraft performance, yet they filtered every piece of information through assumptions already made. When data supported their beliefs, it was emphasized. When it contradicted them, it was minimized or explained away. This was not negligence. It was confidence hardening into certainty, and certainty narrowing vision. One critical failure was the misunderstanding of American command culture. Japanese doctrine emphasized strict hierarchy. Orders flowed downward, and deviation was discouraged. Pilots were expected to follow plans precisely, even when conditions changed. American pilots operated differently. They were trained to act when communication failed, to take initiative when leaders were lost, and to press attacks even when coordination broke down. To Japanese analysts, this appeared chaotic and inefficient. In reality, it was a system designed to survive confusion. Japanese intelligence also underestimated the role of American industrial strength. Training programs were built to produce large numbers of pilots quickly, knowing that combat losses were inevitable. The United States accepted that pilots would be less polished at first, but expected them to improve rapidly under combat conditions. Japanese planners viewed this as wasteful and crude. They believed excellence could not be rushed. What they failed to consider was scale. The United States could afford to learn through loss. Japan could not. There were warning signs. American carrier operations showed increasing coordination. Communications improved. Strike groups adapted after each battle. Yet these developments were seen as temporary adjustments rather than systemic strength. Intelligence officers concluded that American success depended on favorable circumstances rather than skill. When those circumstances disappeared, they believed American pilots would collapse. Even American aircraft were misjudged. Japanese pilots respected the ruggedness of U.S. planes, but dismissed their pilots as slow and predictable. They did not anticipate how American aviators would use altitude, timing, and persistence to compensate for technical disadvantages. Nor did they expect pilots to continue attacking despite overwhelming losses. This behavior defied Japanese expectations of rational engagement. Perhaps the greatest failure was the assumption that intelligence itself was complete. Japanese planners believed they understood American intentions. They believed they knew where the U.S. carriers were and how quickly they could respond. This confidence removed urgency from their preparations. Defensive measures were designed to manage predictable threats, not unexpected ones. By the time the Midway operation was finalized, Japanese intelligence no longer asked whether American pilots might succeed. It asked only when they would fail. The possibility that American doctrine itself posed a threat was not seriously considered. War does not punish ignorance alone. It punishes certainty. And at Midway, certainty was about to meet reality. By late May of 1942, the Midway operation was set in motion with enormous confidence. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto believed he was orchestrating the decisive battle of the Pacific War. His plan was complex, but to Japanese commanders, it appeared flawless. Midway Atoll would be attacked and threatened with invasion, forcing the United States to send its remaining aircraft carriers to defend it. Once those carriers revealed themselves, Japan's superior naval air power would destroy them in a single crushing blow. Japanese intelligence reinforced this confidence at every level. Analysts estimated that at most 2 American carriers remained operational in the Pacific. They believed these ships would arrive late, separated, and poorly coordinated. According to their projections, American pilots would launch rushed attacks, fail to synchronize their strikes, and expose themselves to destruction by experienced Japanese fighter defenses. The battle was expected to be violent, but brief. The Japanese carrier force assigned to the operation represented the heart of the Imperial Navy's striking power. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, carried veteran air groups that had dominated the Pacific since the war began. Their pilots trusted their leaders. Their leaders trusted intelligence. There was little doubt that the coming battle would confirm everything they believed about American weakness. The plan itself reflected this certainty. Japanese carriers would strike Midway first, destroying its air defenses. Aircraft would then be rearmed to attack American ships once they appeared. Defensive patrols were organized to counter expected threats, not unexpected ones. There was no allowance for sudden disruption. No expectation of surprise at a strategic level. Confidence also shaped timing. Japanese commanders believed they controlled the pace of the battle. They expected to find American carriers after the Midway strike, not before. Reconnaissance was structured accordingly, with gaps accepted as reasonable risk. Intelligence assured commanders that even if American carriers arrived early, their pilots would not be able to mount an effective attack quickly. What Japanese planners did not fully consider was how much depended on their assumptions being correct. The Midway operation allowed little margin for error. Aircraft were to be refueled and rearmed on open decks. Fighters would be drawn low to defend against predictable attacks. Every step depended on the enemy behaving as expected. As the fleet moved toward Midway, there was no sense of danger, only anticipation. Japanese commanders believed they were about to witness the final proof of their superiority. The trap was set, and they were certain they understood their enemy. They were wrong. Across the Pacific, American carrier pilots prepared for battle with far less confidence and far fewer illusions. The men aboard Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown knew the odds were against them. Many had survived earlier defeats. Some had watched friends die at Coral Sea or Pearl Harbor. They were not veterans of long, carefully planned campaigns. They were learning in real time, under pressure, with little room for error. On paper, these pilots looked inferior. Many had fewer flight hours than their Japanese counterparts. Some had only recently qualified for carrier landings. Their aircraft were slower, less agile, and more lightly armed. American commanders understood these weaknesses. They did not deny them. Instead, they focused on doctrine that valued aggression, initiative, and endurance over technical perfection. American naval aviation trained pilots to keep attacking even when plans failed. Strike leaders were encouraged to make decisions independently when communication broke down. Squadrons practiced operating under confusion, not avoiding it. This approach produced uneven results early in the war, but it created pilots who could function when coordination collapsed. Japanese intelligence saw this flexibility as disorder. In battle, it would prove to be strength. Morale among American pilots was complex. There was fear, but there was also resolve. Many believed Midway was a last chance to stop Japanese momentum. If the carriers were lost, the Pacific might be lost with them. This awareness sharpened focus. Pilots understood that survival was uncertain, but hesitation was unacceptable. Leadership played a crucial role. Commanders like Raymond Spruance and Frank Jack Fletcher trusted their airmen to act without constant direction. They expected mistakes, but they valued initiative. When intelligence suggested Japanese carriers were approaching, American pilots were prepared to launch as soon as contact was made, even if coordination was imperfect. These men were not trained to look impressive. They were trained to persist. Japanese intelligence did not account for persistence. It did not consider how pilots would behave when facing overwhelming losses. It assumed rational retreat. It assumed caution would replace aggression. As the American carriers moved toward Midway, their pilots did not expect victory. They expected chaos. They expected losses. They expected to keep attacking anyway. That expectation would shape everything that followed. The morning of June 4, 1942, unfolded exactly as Japanese commanders expected, at least at first. American carrier aircraft began launching in response to contact reports, but coordination quickly broke down. Squadrons became separated. Fighters failed to meet bombers at the right altitude. Torpedo planes flew alone toward the enemy. From the Japanese perspective, it looked like disorder, confusion, and poor planning made real. Japanese carrier decks were already active from the strike on Midway. Aircraft were being recovered, refueled, and rearmed. Fighter patrols circled above, alert and confident. When the first American torpedo squadrons appeared at low altitude, they seemed to confirm everything Japanese intelligence had predicted. These planes arrived without adequate fighter escort. They flew straight into heavy fire. What followed was devastation. One American torpedo squadron after another was cut down. Pilots pressed forward through anti-aircraft fire and swarms of Japanese fighters. Many were shot down before they could launch their attacks. Others released torpedoes under extreme pressure, only to see them miss or fail. Casualties were catastrophic. Entire units were nearly destroyed. To Japanese commanders watching from the bridges of their carriers, this was proof. American pilots, they believed, were brave but ineffective. Their attacks lacked coordination. Their losses were enormous. The defensive system was working exactly as designed. Japanese fighters dominated the skies, and carrier operations continued without interruption. Yet something was changing, unnoticed at first. Japanese fighter patrols were drawn lower and lower to intercept the persistent torpedo attacks. Aircraft that should have been guarding high altitude were now focused near the sea. Fuel was consumed. Ammunition was expended. The defensive screen was stretched thin. Below, the American torpedo squadrons continued to attack despite overwhelming losses. There was no retreat. No pause to regroup. Pilots flew on, even when it was clear they would not survive. Japanese intelligence had never expected this. Doctrine assumed rational behavior. These attacks were not rational. They were relentless. On the carrier decks, Japanese crews rushed to keep operations moving. Aircraft were being rearmed for a second strike on Midway or prepared for an attack on American carriers once located. Bombs and fuel lines lay exposed. The tempo increased. Risk increased with it. To the Japanese, the battle still appeared under control. They believed the enemy had already failed. What they did not see was that the chaos they dismissed was reshaping the battlefield. Above the clouds, another force was approaching. The relentless American torpedo attacks created problems Japanese commanders had not planned for. Their air defenses were designed to defeat clean, coordinated strikes, not waves of sacrificial assaults that refused to break off. As torpedo planes continued to appear at low altitude, Japanese fighters were repeatedly pulled downward to intercept them. The immediate threat demanded attention, even as it drained the carrier force of its protective balance. High above, the skies were growing dangerously empty. Fighters that should have been guarding against dive bombers remained focused near the surface. Japanese doctrine emphasized protecting the fleet from the most obvious danger, and at that moment, the torpedo planes seemed to be that danger. No one wanted to allow a single torpedo to reach a carrier's hull. This decision felt rational. It was also fatal. On the carrier decks, pressure mounted. Aircraft from the Midway strike were returning low on fuel. Others were partially armed and waiting for new orders. Japanese commanders debated whether to strike Midway again or prepare for the American carriers now believed to be nearby. Orders changed. Bombs were moved. Torpedoes were brought up from below. Fuel lines were laid out across the decks. This was the most vulnerable moment in carrier warfare. Aircraft crowded the flight decks. Explosives were exposed. Fires could not be controlled quickly. The Japanese system depended on uninterrupted operations and perfect timing. The ongoing torpedo attacks disrupted that timing without delivering direct damage. From the Japanese perspective, the danger still appeared manageable. The torpedo planes were being destroyed. The carriers were unharmed. Losses among American squadrons were devastating. Everything suggested that the enemy was exhausting himself in futile attacks. What Japanese commanders did not know was that American dive bombers were still unaccounted for. They had become separated earlier in the chaos and were searching independently for the enemy. Without centralized control, they followed intuition, navigation skill, and chance. This kind of attack did not fit Japanese expectations. It was not orderly. It was not predictable. The torpedo squadrons, nearly annihilated, had accomplished something no intelligence report had anticipated. They had fixed Japanese attention at the worst possible moment. They had drawn fighters low. They had forced deck crews into frantic activity. They had created a brief, fragile window of vulnerability. That window was about to close. Then, in the silence above the fleet, shadows began to appear. Just after 10 in the morning, American dive bombers appeared out of the sky. They came from high altitude, where Japanese fighters were absent and unprepared. For a brief moment, they were almost unopposed. To the men on the Japanese carriers below, the sight was shocking. This was not the enemy they had planned for. This was not how the battle was supposed to unfold. The dive bombers descended with terrifying speed. Sirens wailed. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, but there was little time to react. The flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were crowded with fueled aircraft and exposed munitions. Bombs struck where damage would be catastrophic. Fires spread instantly. Explosions followed. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers were mortally wounded. Japanese commanders struggled to understand what was happening. Moments earlier, the battle had seemed under control. Now decks burned, aircraft detonated, and damage control teams were overwhelmed. Orders could not be heard. Communications failed. The precision that defined Japanese carrier operations collapsed under the weight of sudden destruction. On Akagi, Admiral Chuchi Nagumo watched as his flagship became a burning ruin. Attempts to fight the fires failed. Heat and smoke filled the ship. On Kaga and Soryu, explosions ripped through hangar decks, turning carefully prepared strike aircraft into fuel for infernos. Years of training, experience, and confidence were consumed in minutes. Only Hiri remained operational. Its air group launched counterattacks that would cripple Yorktown, briefly restoring hope. But the damage had already been done. The balance of the battle had shifted irreversibly. The core of Japan's carrier strength was gone. The attack did not last long. In less than 6 minutes, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost what it could never replace. Not just ships, but veteran air crews, deck crews, and institutional knowledge built over decades. No intelligence failure could have been more complete. The laughter and dismissal that once followed assessments of American pilots were gone. In their place was shock, confusion, and a dawning realization. The war had changed. In the aftermath of the battle, Japanese commanders searched for explanations. The loss at Midway was too sudden, too complete, to be accepted at face value. Some blamed bad luck. Others pointed to timing or individual mistakes. But beneath these surface explanations lay a deeper truth. Japan had not been defeated by inferior ships or inferior pilots. It had been defeated by assumptions. Japanese intelligence before Midway did not fail to gather information. It failed to interpret it honestly. Analysts measured American pilots by Japanese standards and concluded they were inadequate. They counted flight hours, training length, and formation discipline. What they did not measure was adaptability, persistence, and willingness to accept loss in pursuit of success. The belief that elite skill always triumphs shaped every decision. It influenced how Japanese carriers were deployed, how fighter patrols were positioned, and how risks were calculated. When American torpedo squadrons attacked repeatedly despite devastating losses, Japanese commanders interpreted this as incompetence rather than intent. They believed the enemy was exhausting himself. In reality, the enemy was creating opportunity. American doctrine accepted chaos as part of war. Japanese doctrine sought to eliminate it. At Midway, chaos became a weapon. American pilots did not need perfect coordination. They needed time, pressure, and persistence. The intelligence system designed to predict their failure could not recognize their success when it appeared. There was also a structural problem. Japanese naval aviation relied on a small pool of elite pilots who could not be replaced quickly. Losses at Midway destroyed a replaceable experience. The United States, by contrast, built systems designed to scale. Training programs expanded. Lessons from Midway were studied, shared, and institutionalized. What Japan lost, America multiplied. Perhaps most damaging was the confidence that preceded the battle. Japanese planners believed they understood the enemy so completely that doubt was unnecessary. This belief reduced flexibility. It narrowed options. When events unfolded differently than expected, there was little capacity to adapt. Midway exposed the limits of intelligence built on certainty rather than skepticism. It showed that underestimating an enemy's doctrine can be as dangerous as underestimating their weapons. The defeat was not accidental. It was the logical result of flawed assumptions carried into battle. The consequences would extend far beyond one engagement. Before Midway, Japanese intelligence dismissed American pilots as unskilled and uncoordinated, men who lacked the discipline and experience required for modern naval warfare. That judgment shaped plans, expectations, and decisions at every level of command. It created confidence where caution was needed and certainty where doubt might have saved lives. At Midway, those assumptions were not merely challenged. They were destroyed. The battle marked a turning point not because of technology, but because of understanding. American pilots did not win through superior aircraft or flawless execution. They won through persistence, initiative, and a doctrine that allowed them to keep fighting when plans failed. Their willingness to press attacks under impossible conditions reshaped the battlefield in ways Japanese commanders never anticipated. For Japan, the loss went far beyond 4 carriers. Veteran aircrews, carefully trained over many years, were gone. The institutional knowledge that made early victories possible vanished in a single morning. Japan would continue to fight with determination, but it would never again command the skies with the confidence it held before Midway. For the United States, Midway proved something essential. It showed that adaptability could overcome experience, and that doctrine mattered as much as equipment. The victory restored confidence, shifted momentum, and marked the beginning of a long, grinding advance across the Pacific. In the end, Midway stands as a warning written in fire. Underestimating an enemy does not make them weaker. It blinds those who believe it. Japanese intelligence laughed at American pilots before the battle. After Midway, there was nothing left to say. The balance of the war had changed forever.